So why are there 5 page view triggers in Google Tag Manager? And why are there 2 click triggers in Google Tag Manager? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain every trigger type that is available in Google Tag Manager. And I'm going to try to do that within 15 minutes. So let's see if I can pull that off. Hey and welcome to the channel. My name is Leon. This channel exists to help you use web analytics to become more effective in your daily work. I want to thank everyone that has been liking my videos and has subscribed to the channel, because that really helps me get these videos out to as many people as I can. As a way to say thank you, I've created a short cheat sheet on how you can grow your website traffic. So if you're interested in that, just head over to the video description. You'll find a link to that cheat sheet there for free. Also, if you like this video and want to watch more, just head over to my profile. I've created tons of videos over the past years on how to set up Google Tag Manager, how to use Google Analytics, etc. So with that out of the way, let's head over to the video. All right, let's go into Google Tag Manager and let's open up the triggers section in Google Tag Manager. Let's go into new and then into trigger configuration, because here we will find a list of all the available trigger types in Google Tag Manager. And these are all grouped, so there are 5 different page view triggers. These are all associated with people opening up a page. Then there are 2 click triggers, so people clicking things on your site. There are 2 flavors of that. 4 user engagement triggers for determining, like, is a specific element visible? Is a form submitted? Are people scrolling on my site? Are people watching videos? And there are some other triggers, for instance, the custom event and the trigger group. Let's start out by explaining the page view triggers. So the page view triggers are all made for triggering tags when somebody opens up a page. And that could be all pages. So I could make basically a trigger for all pages. There's a built-in one for this, but the all pages trigger is basically just a page view that fires on all page views. Or you could make a thank you page trigger. For instance, something like this. So I could do form contact and then say some page views, and then page path contains contact and then thank you, something like this. So this would be a very common use case. But does it really matter if you use the page view, the DOM ready, the window loaded, or even the consent initialization or the initialization triggers? What's really the difference between these 5 trigger types? Well, let's go over that using this example container right here. So I've set up a very simple container right here with just a cookie banner, a Google tag, and a GA4 event. And as you can see, I have associated different trigger types to each event. And let's go into preview mode and I will show you what this does. So my thank you page is at this page right here. So let me connect this, and this will open up a preview session that has a Tag Assistant connected. And if I go back into Tag Assistant, I can see exactly what happens by going through this timeline right here. And number 1 is the earliest, so whenever I just opened up the page, and then after that, this is everything that happens afterwards. So consent initialization, as you can see, is the very first thing on the list, and this is a built-in trigger, and this corresponds to the consent initialization all pages trigger right here. And why is this called consent initialization? Well, this is the trigger that is built for consent management platforms. So for instance, Cookiebot. So I'm running the Cookiebot tag right here. And why is this first? Well, all the other tags that follow after this will need to know, is consent given, yes or no? So this is the first trigger that runs. So Google Tag Manager will automatically process everything that happens right here, so that all the tags that follow afterwards will know if consent is given, yes or no. So this is the first thing that runs, and it is meant only for cookie banners or consent mode tags. So don't run any other tags on the consent initialization trigger, because it's really meant only for things like Cookiebot or other consent management platforms or consent mode tags. Then if we follow this timeline, there's another built-in trigger right here. It's called initialization, and currently I have set my Google tag to that. And initialization trigger will fire all the tags before anything else. So it doesn't matter what follows. So I have a view item, data layer event, and then there's a thank you page event right here. But by putting tags on the initialization trigger, that will force them to load before anything else. And that is very beneficial, because the Google tag will need to load before I can track events. So I need to know that the Google tag is loaded before I can track other events. And on this very page, you can see that right here on container loaded. This will correspond to the all pages or just the regular page view. But here I'm firing the contact form submit event. And by firing the Google tag on the initialization trigger, I make sure that Google tag is loaded first and the event tag is loaded after that. So that's why it's best practice to load the Google tag on the initialization all pages. So this will just make sure that GA4 is always loaded before anything else is loaded. And then I can use the all pages trigger or the page view trigger in this case. So the page view trigger, I can use that to fire my GA4 event. So if you look closely, there are two others right here. So DOM ready and window loaded. And these are two events that give a little bit more delay. So the DOM ready is loaded whenever the entire HTML document, so the source code of the page, is loaded. And then the window loaded is whenever the entire page, including all the assets like images, fonts, etc., is processed and the page is ready to go. So when would you use the DOM ready and when would you use the window loaded? Well, I use the DOM ready whenever I'm scraping something off of the page. So for instance, if you have like, thank you for your donation of 12 euros. If you would have a text like that, sometimes I will just use that piece of text and send that along with my conversion value as a conversion value. And that's just an example. But then I cannot use the page view tag because that will fire a little bit too early. So if you would visualize that, so whenever the page starts loading, so it's still at the top of the page, then the page view will already fire. So in this case, this event is set to page view. But if I want this to fire a little bit later, so I can scrape things off the page and send them along with the tag, I use the DOM ready for that. And if I hit preview, we will find that that event is set to not the container loaded, not the page view, but the DOM ready right here. So this one is empty right here, and the DOM ready now contains the contact form submit. And I can even delay it even further by saying, oh no, I want it even later in the page view. So sometimes there's something going on with the order, or you want it to wait a little bit longer. Sometimes even for page view or for page load purposes. I've seen tutorials online that state that if you put things on the window loaded, it makes the page feel faster and snappier. So that could be a reason to put things on window loaded. But I could delay this even further by placing this not on the DOM ready, but on the window loaded. So let's hit save. Let's hit preview again. So again, this will open up my thank you page in the tag assistant. So it's connected. And currently the window loaded, the built-in trigger that's associated with all pages or the regular page view trigger type, it's empty. The DOM ready is also empty. And then the window loaded, that's where I'm currently setting the event. But in this case, it doesn't really matter which one I use, as long as I use one of these three. So as long as I use either window loaded, DOM ready, or page view, but the initialization is really meant for the Google tag, and the consent initialization is really meant for the cookie banner. All right, let's talk about click triggers. And there are two flavors, click just links and click all elements. And let's go ahead and make an example trigger with the click just links, and let's see what it does. So I'm just gonna call this click example. And right now I've picked the click just links trigger type, and I want it to fire on all link clicks. Let's see what this does. And I've already made a GA4 event click example. So let's choose our click example trigger with this tag, and let's see what this does. So I'm gonna hit preview mode, currently previewing my homepage right here. And the click just links will fire on all link clicks, on all links on the page. So this could be something in the navigation. So for instance, this one right here. So in my timeline, I have now 2 pages, 1 and 2, and I went from this to this page on this link click right here. And I can track that with the click just links tag. So this will just fire on all links. So I can go back to the home page, and that will fire another link click. And I can even press this button, because in the source code, this is just a text link that is just styled as a button. So if I press this button right here, I will also track this link click. So the click all links is a great way to just catch all link clicks, all navigation clicks on your site. And it's a very easy way of just tracking all links. And I do this all the time. But in some cases, you don't want to track all link clicks. You want to track some link clicks. And some common use cases of this would be, for instance, saying something like this. So click URL contains tell, what's this called? Semicolon. And this will just track all the clicks on phone number links. Or you could also do mail to and then semicolon. This will track all clicks on email address links. Or you could do something like this. Click classes contains button. Because on my site, buttons are styled with a button class name. So if I say click classes contains button, this will only trigger on button clicks. So there are all sorts of use cases where you can track very specific clicks on your site. And I have an entire tutorial on how to make these kinds of click triggers. So I will link that video in the video description. But this is a good example of what you can do with the click just links trigger. There's also a click all elements trigger, and this will do what it says. So if I just use click all elements and say this trigger fires on all clicks, this will literally trigger on every click, even when somebody clicks nothing. So let's say, for instance, this white space, if I decide to press here, it is going to fire my tag. And if I press this title right here, it's going to fire my tag. So this in general is not what you want, because this will give you a lot of data that's not really needed. It will really pollute your reporting. So why is this trigger here? Well, there are some use cases where you want to track specific things that aren't really links. For instance, if you are in a contact form right here, this button, in the source code, this is not a text link, but this is a button element. So if you want to track these kinds of elements, you need a trigger like this. You need to use the click dash all elements, because the click just links will only work on things that are in the source code really a link and not, for instance, a button element. So there are exceptions. Also, if you have, for instance, a frequently asked questions and you have this accordion element, maybe you have seen this, where you have a list of things and then you press it and then it will open up. In many cases, those lines will not be marked up as text links, so you need to track it using this trigger type. But if you're using this trigger type, I recommend to make conditions like this. So some clicks and then click element matches CSS selector. And this is, of course, a little bit more advanced of an advanced GTM technique, but this method of specifying your elements will really make sure that you're tracking the right elements. So for instance, if I want to track this button right here, I could do something like this, input, and then the class name of that. So I could do something like this, input dot, and then something like this, or input and then type is submit, something like this. And this will really make sure that the click all elements trigger will only fire on that specific element. And if you have an element that has an icon underneath it, so for instance you have a piece of text but also a small icon or an arrow to the right, some buttons do have that, it's sometimes necessary to just copy this and then press comma, paste it again, and then hit star. So let's do this in a text file. So this is what you're basically tracking. So you're tracking the element itself, and then you're tracking all the elements underneath it. So this might be a little bit too technical, but I just wanted to give one example of when you would use the click all elements trigger type. To be honest, in most cases, the click just links is what I really recommend, especially if you're a beginner. Yes, let's talk about the user engagement trigger types. So there are 4 flavors here. We have the scroll depth, the element visibility, the form submission, and the YouTube video. I want to start out by making an example with the scroll depth trigger type. So let's use that. Let's give this a name. So scroll depth. Whenever you choose this trigger type, you get the option of tracking vertical scroll depth, so up and down. And then you have horizontal scroll depth where you can track left to right. But of course, the most common one is vertical. And then you could give some percentages right here. So what I like to do is 25, 50, and 75, sometimes 10. And then the 90% is tracked by GA4 itself. I leave that out usually. But 25, 50, and 75% is what I like to start with. And then this tracks whenever somebody goes over the threshold. So for instance, currently I'm at approximately 25% of my scroll depth. So that will track an event there. And then at 50% and then at 75%, it will track an event. So I could also track pixels, but of course every page is different. So that's why I like to go with the percentages by default. If I press save and I want to make a tag with this, let's go ahead and let's go into new. Let's make a new GA4 tag. I'm gonna call this scroll depth. Let me find my GA4 measurement ID right here. The way that I like to set things up here is by including the percentage in the event name. So I would set it up like this. So scroll depth and then the percentage, the threshold that somebody crossed. You can include it in your event name by pressing this variable icon right here and then going into built-ins. And then there's a scroll. Let me find it real quick. So there's a scroll depth threshold right here. This will return scroll depth and then dash, and then for instance 25, 50 or 75 depending on where people are scrolling currently. And then under triggering, I'm just gonna choose the scroll depth trigger that I just made. So it's this one. And if I save this and if I preview this, this is what's going to happen. So I am on my homepage right here. Tag Assistant is connected. Currently there's no scroll event yet because I didn't scroll. As soon as I start scrolling and I'm past the 25% mark, I get a scroll depth and the percentage is automatically included in the event name. And if I go on over the 50% mark, there's a scroll depth 50, and then underneath there's a 75 being tracked. So that's how I would use the scroll depth trigger type. Well, there are a couple of other trigger types, so let's open up the trigger configuration real quick. So there's, we've already covered the scroll depth. There's also an element visibility. This works kind of the same way, but then you could choose a specific element. For instance, if you have a specific call to action and you want to know like how many times have people watched this specific call to action, you can make a trigger that just will fire as soon as that element is visible. That is a little bit more complicated. I will cover how to use that in a different video because you need to know a little bit more about the HTML of a specific page. But another use case of this trigger would be if somebody has viewed a pop-up that you have on your site. So you might have a cookie banner or some other pop-up and you want to know like how many people have seen this specific pop-up. Well, you can use the element visibility trigger for that as well. Then you have the form submission trigger that will listen for form submissions. So that could be a search form or a contact form. The downside of this trigger type is that it has a hard time checking for like, is it valid? So for instance, my contact form, you can go ahead and just hit send, but I have some validation. So my form will check like, is this a valid email address? Is the name filled in? And if the form is not valid, this trigger has a tendency to track conversions that didn't happen yet. So for instance, if a user has not filled out the contact form entirely and that user hits send, this trigger might track that form already, even though the form wasn't valid and hasn't really sent yet. Also, in some cases, this form trigger doesn't catch form submissions. Sometimes the form submissions are entirely handled through JavaScript. It really depends on how your developer has built the website. So to be honest, I use this as a last resort. So personally, I prefer to make a thank you page trigger like I showed you earlier. So I just make a page view or DOM ready. I fire that on a thank you page. So that's a really reliable way of tracking forms. And I use the form submission trigger only if there's no thank you page in place, and I will test thoroughly if it's really working or not, because this tends to be a little bit more shaky than just a solid thank you page trigger. All right, so we've covered the scroll depth, the form submission, the element visibility. There's also a YouTube video trigger type. To be honest, I never use this because GA4 tracks YouTube videos by default. But if you want to track YouTube videos to different platforms, for instance, you want to send events to Facebook ads or your Matomo or your Piwik Pro, you could use this trigger type to make your custom event setup with YouTube videos. We have one more group to go, and this is the other group. And this group contains some more advanced and technical trigger types. The most common one, the one that I use most, is the custom event. And this custom event trigger will respond to data layer calls. And data layer calls are a little bit more technical, but they are really common in e-commerce, in web shops. So for instance, this piece of code is really common within e-commerce. This is a piece of code that is often used when somebody opens up a product. In this piece of code, you will find an event name, view item, and then an e-commerce object that contains a value and the currency, and then a list of the items or item that has been viewed. Let's say that your developer has put this on every product of your site, and I have installed it manually on my site. So here is a view item data layer call. It's exactly just the sample code. You can find out more by going into the view item if you have it, and then by opening up this block right here, you see that I'm running this exact piece of code. And let's pretend that this is a product where I have this Google t-shirt. So I can trigger a view item tag whenever this snippet is loaded by just using the event name. And I can build a trigger by using the custom event and then putting the event name right here. So if I want to track events, I could do just something like this. I've made already the view item tag right here. It's very simple. I didn't even put in all the parameters. But if I attach a trigger, like a custom event trigger with the view item name, this will correspond with the event name in the data layer snippet. And that makes sure that this event is tracked whenever this piece of code is run. So let's just save this. Let me show it real quick. So if I hit preview, and let's pretend that this is a product page, I have a view item snippet on the page. It's running here. And because the event name corresponds with my custom event trigger right here, my view item tag has loaded as exactly on the moment when that event was pushed to the data layer. So this tag is really common in e-commerce setups, and I might do a dedicated tutorial on this trigger type in the future. All right, so there are a few more trigger types in the list. The trigger group is another one that's really interesting. This will let you make triggers based on other triggers. So you could do something like this. You could do, for instance, a thank you page trigger and combine it with, let me just pick something, a scroll depth trigger. And this trigger will only fire if both of these triggers have fired on that page. There are a lot of use cases for this, especially in dealing with very tricky consent scenarios where you want to track things, but consent is needed first, and sometimes that takes a while to load. Well, trigger groups are a great way of waiting for something to happen until other things have happened. Of course, this is very abstract at this point, and again, this could be its own tutorial, but the trigger group is a very powerful way of building complex trigger setups. Let's go back and let's look at the others real quick. So you have the history change trigger right here, and the history change trigger is very common if you have a website that's running entirely in JavaScript. So you're loading the page, but once you start clicking, you're not really refreshing the page, but you just see the URL change, and JavaScript handles the rest. It might be a little bit too technical for some of you, but for instance, Gmail would be a good example. You just load up Gmail and then you start clicking, and it never really refreshes the page like it does on like a regular website. Well, then you are very likely using a JavaScript-based website. Well, this is a trigger that runs, that listens for changes in the history. So if you navigate from one page to the other, but it doesn't really refresh the page, well, then you cannot use the regular page view triggers, but you can use the history change triggers to find out if people are navigating to different sections of your website. The JavaScript error just does what it says that it does. It runs whenever there is a JavaScript error. And sometimes I'd like to do this whenever I think that there is a mistake, for instance, in a form. I just run this site-wide to find out on what pages there are JavaScript errors happening and what exactly is going wrong. Okay, the last tag that I want to talk about is the timer. And I have an example set up right here where I filled in the limit to 1 and the interval to 3 seconds. And this will make sure that a tag will be fired after a user has viewed that page for 3 seconds. And be careful, because if a user navigates to a different page, it starts again counting. So if you have, for instance, a 20-second interval, it's not going to load if a user just only stays for a couple of seconds per page and then leaves. So it's an interval that it starts counting the moment somebody opens up a new page. You could even track something every second by just going, and then if you remove the limit, it's just going to repeat itself again and again. To be honest, I don't use this very often, but I have seen setups where people, for instance, make an event to determine, like, is a user still actively reading on a page after 10 or 15 seconds. Alright, that's it for today. I hope this video was clear and I hope it was helpful. If you have questions, please leave them down in the comments below. Also, if you like this video and want to watch more, just head over to my profile. You'll find all sorts of videos just like this there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.